All right, this is the final meeting of this course for this semester. And as I said last time, I decided that in lieu of teaching the second semester of the course in the next term, I would give a sort of a trailer of things that might or might not actually arise during the second semester. Since I won't teach it until next fall, and I usually don't know until I walk into the room exactly what I'm doing, or sometimes substantially after that. I'm not sure any of these will arise, but they may give you some flavor of what interests me about the post-1500 period. It's much easier to say what doesn't interest me. I have almost no interest in issues of gender, class, and race. This has been the great triad of historical conscience now for a couple of generations, and I'm not sure how much more there is to say. I remember when a doctoral dissertation that was being done, it was not yet written, but the author had an agent and he was sending it around to publishers before the dissertation was written, and it was going to be the story of what it was like to be gay in Philadelphia in the 1950s. I remember it came to the publication committee of Columbia Press, and I thought, you know, if we publish it, because we had a very good list in gay and lesbian studies, probably the first of the university presses. I said, you know, then we'll have a book on what it was like to be gay in Dayton in the 1950s or in Pensacola in the 1950s. I mean, how much do you need to write about any given subject before you have pretty much cleared the air on the matter? So gender, race, and class don't interest me very much. To a even greater degree, I have almost no interest in the concept of modernity. I, for the life of me, really don't know what it is, and I think chewing on it any longer is not going to produce any more flavor. It's like an old piece of gum that at a certain point it's just chewing. And if you don't know what modernity is, then what in the world is postmodernity other than taking that old piece of gum and chewing it on the other side of your mouth? So I'm not interested in postmodernity. This manages to leave me way out on some other limb in contemporary historical disciplinary terms, and I'm happy to be there. But it means that I don't have a great overriding conceptual theme that I would follow in the second semester, except to try and talk about the whole world. One of the problems I see with the issues of gender, race, and class, and with modernity, is that you track down the roots, and lo and behold, you get to Europe. And I think that there are other things that I would rather talk about. So I've jotted down 8 or 10 topics, and I'm just going to say a little bit about each of them, or as much as I can go through, to suggest some of the things that I think tend not to be discussed in world histories, either in textbooks or in more one-off, one-volume world history things, but I think should be. The first of them picks up from a lecture that I gave earlier on the seeming reversal of climatic importance as you move from the Western Hemisphere to the from the Eastern Hemisphere to the Western Hemisphere, so that the tropics that are understood in the Eastern Hemisphere to be places of exoticism, lassitude, savagery, and human limitations in terms of anything that could contribute to civilization. That appears to, and all the stuff that people like to write about is in the temperate zone, particularly the North Temperate Zone, and in the Western Hemisphere, it's reversed, and all the stuff people like to talk about is happening in the tropics. Nobody ever accused the Aztecs or the Incas of lack of energy or, being too warm to build an empire. While the temperate zones were very, very lightly populated by comparison with the tropics. And that circumstance of tropical vigor versus tropical indolence and temperate zone indolence versus temperate zone vigor as you shift from hemisphere to hemisphere, I think is an intriguing subject, as I mentioned before. Now, what I would do if I were pursuing this the next semester was to spin out some of the implications of this. And perhaps the most striking is that in the temperate zones to which the Europeans migrated in the post-exploration era, that is to say North America, the southern cone of South America, and I'm going to throw in Australia, or at least southern Australia, into this, even though it is in the eastern hemisphere. It was not a known continent. One of the striking things I don't think has been attended to very much is the emptiness of these areas. To encounter empty territory is very different from moving into a world that is already fairly heavily populated. Now, of course, they were not empty, but one of the results of the European expansion into the New World and into Australia, New Zealand, was the decimation of the local population, so that a population that had never been terribly dense becomes much, much less dense as a result of the diseases that come with the Europeans. So that in these three areas, the southern cone, North America, and Australia, New Zealand, you have enormous amounts of land. That is an extraordinary phenomenon, particularly from the point of view of Europeans who were coming from a continent that had filled up its land by the 16th century, and where frontiers had closed, and the issue of fighting over who gets what land had become central to the politics. Now you had a place with vast quantities of land, and of course, when you look at the history of settlement, the notion of owning land becomes a riveting issue for people who move. It isn't that, people migrate from Europe to North America or to Australia in order to do exactly what they did before. Be a shoemaker or a cordwainer or whatever. I guess cordwainers and shoemakers are the same thing. But rather, there's the idea that you can get land. And I think that is an interesting phenomenon. But you also have an aspect of it, because there were areas of empty land in the old world. Let's say the Eurasian steppe was comparatively empty. There were some comparatively empty areas elsewhere, but what you had in the empty areas of the old world was pastoral nomadism. So that if you moved into the Eurasian steppe or into some of the lesser populated parts of the Middle East, North Africa, arid zone, northern India, some areas of temperate zone, southern Africa, you moved into an area that was not heavily populated, but the population was made up of pastoral nomads who were exploiting the land in an efficient fashion, but not an efficient fashion from the point of view of a monetized market economy. In other words, having animals on the land constituted the form of wealth that was valued, rather than having animals that could be exchanged for money or other goods, which were then regarded as a form of wealth. Having goods was of limited value for pastoral peoples because they had to be mobile. So that pastoralists needed wealth that was as migratory as they themselves were, and the animals constituted that wealth. But what you had in the New World, in Australia, was empty land that did not have pastoral nomads because you did not have herd animals among the native fauna. So the result is that you have a vast surge of European animals into these areas, the southern cone, North America, and Australia. Sheep and cattle, horses, donkeys, pigs, etc. There is a very nice book called A Plague of Sheep that talks about the arrival of sheep in northern Mexico and the Texas, New Mexico, Arizona area, and showing that the sheep multiplied with absolutely incredible rapidity. So you started with a few sheep, and seemingly in just a matter of years, you had millions of sheep. And it raised an interesting question. There had been animals in these semi-arid and arid areas before, like pronghorn and so on, and there had been animals that ate them. Wolves and cougars and so on. But they didn't eat the sheep, or they didn't eat the sheep fast enough. I think that why that's the case, I think it would be interesting to find out. I mean, was it that if you were a cougar, you thought, I could eat that, but it's just a big mouthful of wool, and frankly, it doesn't taste that good. It's all, yeah. Whereas here you have a nice lean pronghorn, I'd rather eat it. One of the things about prey-predator systems is that the prey animals evolve in tandem with the predator animals, and they expect to be eaten. They know what they expect to be eaten by. And the predator animals know what the prey animals are. And I'm not sure the cougars knew what the sheep were. Was that fluff ball really edible, and would you prefer it? But whatever the case, either because of remarkable efficiency of reproduction, which I think is part of it, or because the predators did not prey sufficiently upon the new animals, you had, in a fairly short period of time, millions of sheep. And then you had a demographic collapse in which almost all the sheep died because they had no food. They had eaten everything in northern Mexico. And then you had a huge die-off, and then you had a gradual rebuilding, and then a sort of equilibrium that comes about. But this has almost nothing to do with human intervention, other than the introduction of the sheep. Because there was no value in owning sheep. If you weren't a pastoral nomad, owning an animal only meant something if you could either use the product from the sheep or sell it. And the problem is that there was no market. So the only things that were sold, and even then primarily for animals that were in areas close to seaports, would be things like tallow, where you would boil parts of the animal down in order to get big barrels of fat, because tallow could be sold to shipbuilders or ship outfitters, because tallow was very useful on board a ship. But typically, the animal's carcass was simply left, stripped of its. You could sell the hide, the leather, you could sell the tallow, but there was no value to the meat. You just leave thousands of sheep or cattle lying there, skinned in the countryside for scavengers to eat, because they didn't have any value. So one of the things that happens is that these temperate zone areas become the locus of a new relationship between market and food production, and that is what can be called ranching economies. In other words, there were no ranching economies on a parallel scale in Europe, although Spain approached it with its wool. Spain and England approached it with the sale of wool. But by and large, we are dealing here with ranching economies that are a singular aspect of the temperate zones, of the colonial temperate zones. And that is part of a broader phenomenon, which is that the colonial temperate zones become huge sources of food for the world, down to the present day. This is where great quantities of food can be produced and marketed. There is a relationship of food production to the market, and not just the domestic market, but ultimately to the export market, that singles out these areas. Because one of the things I think that ultimately has to be discussed is why the temperate colonial zones in many ways follow a very different track politically and economically from the European metropole. Now, related to that, there is world systems theory, which is the brainchild of the SUNY Binghamton professor Emanuel Wallerstein. And in Wallerstein's theory, which is derived from Marxist areas of thinking, you have the notion that there is a world system in which Europe is the core, and other parts of the world, both colonies but also parts of the world that are not colonized by the Europeans, that they become part of a periphery feeding goods into the European market. It was, in the last generation, and still is, a very attractive theory, because it shows an economic relationship that is sort of undeniable, that you have these goods coming from the periphery into the core. And it also can be interpreted as explaining why the countries in the periphery do not develop in the same way that the metropolitan core does in Europe, because the Europeans deliberately take steps to curtail non-agricultural or non-commodity production in these colonial areas. And that would be discussed in almost any world history textbook, this relationship of Europe to the colonial core. The problem with the theory, and that one that I would be talking about, would be that it only engages or engages primarily those people in the non-European periphery who become engaged in the world system. Most people don't. Most Chinese farmers do not produce for the European metropole. The same thing in most, in India, most areas. What happens often in world system theory is that you take certain industries and certain products, and you develop their story in detail, and you show who does the exploiting of the product, and where do the profits go, and so forth, and that's all very, very interesting. But you tend to leave out things that happened at the same time that were either not part of the system or that were periphery to periphery relations instead of core to periphery relations. Sometimes you will get a discussion that will deal with periphery to periphery. In other words, the growing of opium in Iran and India for sale to China is a periphery to periphery relationship, and you focus on the European companies that carry out this kind of activity of backing the production of opium for the sale in China and so on. But there are other products that go from periphery to periphery that are left out of this. And knowing what products they are and why they develop in ways that are outside the world system, an interesting question with respect to world system theory. An example would be khat. Khat in Somalia and Yemen is chewed daily. It's a mild, feel-good substance. They're leaves of a tree. Basically, everybody in the country spends all afternoon sitting around chewing khat and feeling pretty damn good. Occasionally sending off a little parcel by FedEx to America, but otherwise just feeling pretty good. But khat does not become one of the great colonial addictions. Coffee does, yeah.
Loses its potency within 72 hours. It can't be shipped unless it's dry.
That's right, and you if you want khat in New York, you have to get it from an airline stewardess who flies to Yemen. But it's a plant that can be grown in other places. I mean, one of the great enterprises of the 19th century in particular is the transplanting of animals and plants to new environments, so that, say, cashews, they're native to Brazil. But the Brazilians apparently never liked cashews very much. Anyway, they didn't grow much, so all the cashews end up being grown over in the Indian Ocean. Or vanilla. The vanilla bean is native to central Mexico. You had Europeans who took the vanilla plant to various places in the Old World tropics, particularly in the Indian Ocean, Madagascar and Réunion. Particularly the French were interested in vanilla, and they grew the plant. The plant grew just fine, and it never produced any fruit, no beans, and that was because the plant did not pollinate. The reason it didn't pollinate was discovered in 1837 by a French scientist who found that there was an itty-bitty bee in central Mexico that pollinated vanilla plants. But the bee could not be transplanted. You could take the vanilla out of Mexico, but you couldn't take the bee out of Mexico. So this was a great problem. So this guy, he figures out a way to pollinate the vanilla plant by hand, and it is so clumsy that it pretty much flops as an enterprise. And then there's a grower on the island of Réunion in the Indian Ocean who has a 12-year-old slave named Edmond Albius. And he has him as sort of a favorite boy around the house who follows him everything and follows him everywhere to his gardens and so forth and sees what he does. And lo and behold, the owner of the gardens discovers that his vanilla plants are producing beans and nobody else's are. And so he asks around and he finds out that Edmond knows how to pollinate vanilla plants by hand. And he invents it. An industry proceeds to arise from the invention of a 12-year-old slave on the island of Réunion, and almost all of the natural vanilla in the world today is produced in Madagascar, Mauritius, Réunion, these islands in the Indian Oceans, because of the discovery of Edmond Albius. And on Réunion there is a small statue of Mr. Albius, who died in poverty in 1880, and is sort of forgotten. But it's assumed that it's the Europeans who do these things. And I think Edmond Albius is one of the great counterexamples of this era. Interestingly, there was a French botanist who claimed that he had taught Albius how to pollinate the plants, and he tried to get credit for it. And there were so many witnesses and so much testimony that he was revealed to be a fraud. And it was Albius who did it. 1841, his slaves were freed by the French in 1848, so he was eventually freed. But he made no money. But then so khat could be grown elsewhere. But then you have, say, yerba mate. You go to Uruguay or Argentina, yerba mate is a common beverage. But, it didn't travel in the way that coffee and tea traveled. And yet it'd be very, very important. Coca tea. We have cocaine, which comes along fairly late, but if you make a trek up to Inca territory, they'll give you coca tea to help you deal with the altitude, which is coca leaves in hot water. And but why isn't coca? Why doesn't it become one of these colonial stimulants like coffee or tea or opium or chocolate? Interestingly, there's this whole business of Coca-Cola, and what is the secret formula of Coca-Cola? Coca-Cola apparently contains decocainized coca leaves that are the psychoactive substance in cocaine, in the coca leaf, is extracted, and the denatured leaves are provided to the Coca-Cola company, and they become part of the flavor, although the most distinctive part of the flavor comes from vanilla and cinnamon, but the coca is there. So then you think, who extracts the cocaine from the leaves? And what do they do with the stuff they extract? It turns out that the extraction is done by the Stepan Corporation in Illinois, and they sell the active substance to Mallinckrodt Laboratories for scientific research and provide the leaves. There's a company that processes food, herbal substances for various purposes. and it was founded by a man named Alfred C. Stepan Jr. Alfred C. Stepan III is a professor of political science here at Columbia University. I have not been able to find any absolute proof that he is the son of the guy who is processing all the cocaine in the country. Al himself likes cigars, but it's a small world, isn't it? But you also get, I say, periphery things, so that, for instance, if you look at the tea that is grown in Iran, and the Iranians are wicked consumers of tea, that wasn't brought in by the Europeans. That it was an Iranian ambassador to Ceylon, what is now Sri Lanka, who brought in the idea of having tea plantations along the Caspian coast. So world systems theory is a wonderful tool, but it tends it expands your vision in certain ways, but can also limit your vision in other ways. And that's something that I would talk about. Post-domesticity. I think this is really important, even though nobody else does. I talked about the development of ranching. The period of the last 200 years has seen an extraordinary and unprecedented evolution in the relationships between humans and domestic animals. It's seen the emergence of what I call post-domesticity. In a nutshell, a very large nut, what I'm talking about here is a long-term world history of animals. I've asked you early in this course to read a couple of chapters of my book on this, where you start with humans hanging out with a whole suite of wild animals. Then a few species become domestic in complicated ways that we don't fully understand, and humans now are faced with a world that has two categories of animals. It has domestic animals and it has wild animals. And everybody recognizes that a domestic animal is not simply a wild animal tamed, but rather it is born domestic, and it never becomes wild as it grows up. So you then have a extraordinary evolution of relationships within domesticity. And those relationships move from being, at least in my interpretation, from being primarily symbolic ritual relations in which the animals play an enormous role in the imaginary of the populations that have them. So you have things like Egyptians worshiping a god they see as represented by a cow or by a donkey or something like that. Initially, the use of the animals is fairly secondary to the imagination, to the imaginary role of the animals, but over time, that relationship reverses, and what you get is an increasingly use-oriented attitude toward animals that reaches its peak in the thinking of Descartes, with the idea that an animal is simply a machine invented by God that is, because it is a divine invention, more clever than the cuckoo clock, but nevertheless it is as insensitive and as devoid of a soul and as devoid of feeling or thought as a cuckoo clock. So this became the philosophical underpinning for an exploitation of animals that increasingly in the 18th and 19th centuries focused upon viewing animals primarily as products rather than as sentient beings. And this lays the groundwork for a reversal of this in the 20th century and the emergence of what I call post-domestic feelings, which are those feelings that people have when they consider the exploitation of animals, factory farming or wanton killing or cruel experimentation, whatever you want, that views the exploitation of animals as a deeply immoral activity, and as a consequence, or in relationship to it, adopts behaviors that are post-domestic behaviors. So post-domesticity, which is by no means universal, but is becoming increasingly widespread, involves things like elective vegetarianism, where without having any religious tradition that requires it, people decide that they wish to be vegetarian or vegan, either because they feel it is healthier, which is common in many cases, or because they don't like to eat anything with a face. Human children probably always had to be, coaxed into eating meat. But in post-domestic homes, often the desire of a child to avoid eating an animal often ends up ruling the entire family, and so the family becomes vegetarian in order to please the 7-year-old. So you have elective vegetarianism. You have opposition to hunting and to animal experimentation. You have a vastly increased interest in discovering the continuities between humans and animals. In other words, if the Cartesian approach was to say that you have an utter disconnect between humans who have a soul and animals that have no soul, no intelligence, no memory, no feeling, the effort now is to discover that, in fact, humans and animals are all together. So we have an interest in whether we can teach language to primates, whether whales can communicate in something that we might call language. This is all part of post-domesticity. And then another part that I won't go into, but fascinates me, is the peculiarity that not exclusively in post-domestic societies, but in post-domestic societies, as people become more and more distant from animals, that is to say, most people today in the United States grow to adulthood without ever seeing an animal killed. I've taken show of hands in my classes, and we'll find maybe 10% have seen an animal killed. I take a show of hands in Lebanon, and I get 90% have seen animals killed. So that the notion of killing an animal becomes increasingly something that produces anxiety. And that carries over into a complex of things in which you have a society in which people do not want to kill animals, they're totally opposed to killing animals, but they really like to watch killing on the screen. So that as the experience with the actual killing of things diminishes, experience with the imaginary of killing increases. So that horror movies and now, of course, everyone's favorite, the zombie headshot, these increase and people relish imaginary killing as they are revolted by real killing. Sometimes this carries over into the real world, into the notion of, those people don't value human life the way we value human life in some political conflict, because once you have stopped killing animals, you can actually think that it's wrong to kill people. And many people do think it's wrong to kill people. But, you know, in these post-domestic societies that are of European background, as most of them are, they evolve from a social system in which the elite, for thousands of years, had, at least among the males, as their primary adult activity was killing people. This is what the nobility did and what they were trained to do. And I find it, in teaching history, one of the most difficult things is to really think about a battle with, like, battle axes, you know, where you go up to someone and you bash them in the face with an axe. But then, you know, you go to your Xbox and you think, hey, I can do that. Or, you know, first-person shooter games. I love first-person shooter games. You got to kill everybody. So this has to do with the separation from animals. I could go into the whole thing as well with sexuality and the rise of pornography and so forth, which also coincides with with the disappearance of human experience with animal sexuality in childhood. I'm not going to pursue this right now. I've written on this. But the point is that the issue of human relations to animals, which can be traced back 100, even 200 years, particularly in Britain, it is an issue that is primarily focused upon the ranching economies that I've talked about, and upon Great Britain, and has more slowly been experienced in the rest of Europe, and separates so-called Western conscience from most of the rest of the world. And one of the interesting questions to raise for the future is, after the success of the World Campaign against slavery, and after the the hoped-for success of the World Campaign to eliminate wanton discrimination against women, and after the possible success of a world campaign to diminish discrimination against people of varied sexual expression, will there be a world campaign to anathematize or criminalize the killing of animals? In other words, will vegetarianism become a moral cause that gets embodied in international relations and so forth, or not? And I think it's very likely that it will. But that is for the future. All I'm trying to point out is that we have a very interesting development in the area of human-animal relations. The next one. Do you have to be enlightened to be scientific? It was a commonplace for travelers from the 16th century onward, when they started to encounter savages in newly explored parts of the world, newly explored from the European perspective, to see them as cognitively incapable of certain things that Europeans are capable of. And gradually you had the idea that Europeans can do science because they have gotten rid of God. And that the questioning of the Roman Catholic faith and the failure of the Protestant faith to produce a credible alternative, and the rise of the Enlightenment, you have the scientific revolution is associated with secularization. And so you had people in the 19th century who said, well, Muslims or Hindus simply can't be modern people unless they can get rid of their foolish beliefs. because that's the essential thing. They don't understand mechanical things. They don't understand scientific processes. Then you go a little bit farther along in time, and travelers to the same area, let's say Afghanistan, who used to say that they cannot understand anything mechanical or scientific, are saying they are so clever on imitating Western arms that they can build a gun that's just like a Western gun, because they're kind of monkey-like. They can imitate, monkey see, monkey do, and so on. And then gradually you have the idea that, well, maybe they could actually make their own weapon. Because what's happened is that science that was originally thought to be a European, sort of a wholly owned subsidiary of Western culture, has become global. And people can be not only successful scientists, but brilliant scientists without having to ever read Immanuel Kant, without ever having to quit reading the Quran. This, for people for whom the great story of modernity is the rise of industrialism and science and secularism, the fact that it can be done by anyone is, let's say, off-putting. So now, when you talk to people about this, if you raise the issue about why is it that English is not spoken on several floors of Columbia buildings that have natural science departments, because Americans don't do natural science anymore, but we send professors over to China to interview people for entry into our physics department or something like that. Why is it that these people who are not the children of the Enlightenment, why is it that they're doing the science? And the answer that's given is, it's because we have the equipment. We have freedom. They can come here and they are free to be great scientists. If they stay home, they will be, sent to a re-education camp or something like that. And now it isn't that the scientific revolution and the mentality of the Enlightenment has produced these things, but rather it is the freedom that we have, plus this really nifty equipment that makes it possible. This is a losing battle. Over time, science is not going to be a Western thing. And we're already finding that so many of the people who do science in this country are, Indians or Pakistanis or Chinese or Koreans or anybody but Americans, because they're too busy working on Wall Street to make money. We haven't really come to grips with what that means in sort of world historical terms, and I think it's one of the things that will happen. So that it may be that, let's say, we tend to look at Nobel Prizes in terms of the passport or the birthplace of people, and it may be that you start looking instead at where the work is carried out. One of the most interesting experiments currently going on is organization known as KAUST, or the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology. This is a university that has been built in Saudi Arabia. It is endowed sort of a Harvard-level endowment. It has vast billions of dollars that are dedicated to it. It is physically isolated from everything in Saudi Arabia that could be a negative influence, and there are several things in Saudi Arabia that could be negative influences. And the determination of King Abdullah, the theory is that if you put enough money and enough equipment into an enterprise, and you dedicate it to producing cutting-edge science, that you will, within a very brief number of years, be getting Nobel Prizes coming out of Saudi Arabia. And it's an interesting proposition. Can you force feed scientific achievement in this fashion? Now, many people are openly skeptical of this. They say this is typical of, Saudi hubris, thinking that they're as smart as anybody else. On the other hand, if you look back at the Bolshevik Revolution, you'll find that exactly the same thing. The Soviets said, Russians can produce science, big science, as well as anyone else if they have the money and the start and the dedication of the government, and they did. Now, one could say that Russians are Europeans, and therefore they have that little science gene that all Europeans have. But it is not implausible to think that we will begin to see major scientific achievements taking place in Saudi Arabia over the next decade or two. And that's going to be very difficult. I mean, the ownership of science has been so much a part of the story of modernity that to have it migrate away from Europe will be very difficult. You're going to have to come up with a new historical understanding of how this happened. Then you can say, well, is it just money? Is it just money? Is that the reason Europe became science? Because they mustered their financial resources differently. Say, yeah, but they had organizations. They had Oxford and Cambridge, for example. Of course, what they taught there was Greek and Latin. But is it money? Is it social networking? What is it? Is religion something that prevents science, or is religion something that is a matter of indifference from the point of view of science? The whole story of how important the Enlightenment was may have to be reconsidered. We've always diddled this story a little bit. You realize that in the history of science and technology, the European tradition has habitually said, other people invented things, but look what we did with them. We were so much more ingenious. The Chinese had the south-pointing chariot, which was the seed of the compass, but we're the ones who really developed the compass. Or the Chinese had fireworks, but we learned how to kill people at a greater efficiency than the Chinese, or so forth and so on. So for a long time, the Europeans said, it isn't important who invents something, but rather who does something with it. Now we get a somewhat different story. Then, because the Europeans start inventing things, then we say what's really important is invention. So the transistor is invented in America, but the Japanese, yeah, they did things with the transistor, like they invented consumer electronics. But we could have done that, but we're too high-minded for that. So the question of whether it is invention or utilization is going to become, I think, increasingly a topic in science and technology as a theme in history. My favorite one here is that the lithograph was invented in Europe, but the lithographed book was a standard in the Muslim world and in East Asia, and the Europeans never developed the lithographed book. But I won't go into that at the moment. On to a related topic here. A lot of economic history for the last 200 or 300 years has focused on capitalism and on capital. Why does capital accumulate? What is capital used for? And so the story of capitalism, starting perhaps with the great joint stock companies of the early 17th century, has been if you accumulate the money and if you invest it in producing goods or improving the production of goods, then you get more money, so forth and so on. And this is what drives or drove European success. So you look at where did the money to build railroads in the United States come from? It was European investors. Where did the money for the Suez Canal come from, or the Panama Canal? It came from Euro-American investors. Who paid for the undersea cables and so forth? And you see, here's this role of capital. We have the history of banking, so forth and so on. So what do we do when the biggest reserves of capital move outside of Europe and America? Do we still say that capital is what we should be following? In other words, when you're dealing with the accumulation of capital in oil states through the rents that are collected on the sale of petroleum products, or the capital that accumulates in China because of trade surpluses, if that capital is used to develop something, is that the same thing as the capitalism of the Dutch East India Company or the English East India Company? Do we revere the capitalist achievements of non-European capitalists? Right now, when you go to different parts of the world, you'll find that there are enormous projects underway that are being paid for by oil capital, or even more by Chinese capital. And you're saying, okay, here's a country that is developed, its copper mines are being developed by the Chinese, or its pipelines are being built by the Chinese and so forth. Do we fold that into the history of capitalism, even though it doesn't follow the institutional structure of joint stock companies? Or do we say that it is something else and something that is somewhat unsavory? No. Is an Arab investor or a Chinese investor as good as a European investor? Of course, none of them look awfully good right now, but nevertheless, the point is there. And I think, again, sort of like with the Enlightenment story, you have a big narrative in modern history that singles out Europe for certain achievements and certain attitudes that turn out in the long run not to be distinctly European, that they start there. And what do you do with that from the point of view of history? Do you give special plaudits to the Europeans for having invented capitalism? Or do you say, look, money is money, and where it accumulates, if there are people who have the will to do it, it can produce more money, and there's no particular virtue to the Europeans except they happen to be a little earlier than other people. In this, as in so many other areas, I think what we're seeing in the last 50 years is a undermining of the assumption of European exceptionalism, the assumption that what Europeans did is better, and the corollary assumption that it's better because there is a certain mentality that enlightened Europeans had that other people don't, because they're held back by their non-European traditions. So then we get to the question of how this relates to religion. Why is religion reviving? There has been for a long time an unspoken, and then increasingly after World War II, a spoken assumption that the modern world will inevitably see the retreat of religion into the realm of private observation and private belief and its movement out of the public sphere. This was a basic assumption of modernization theory that became popular, particularly in the United States, after World War II. And it was on this basic assumption that American scholars and universities, like this one, entered into the study of other parts of the world. Now, we were going to study other parts of the world to see, to observe, as in a laboratory, how, in what particular ways, they learned to be like us. And that included how would they become modern, democratic, free, and capitalistic, but also how would they reject their religions? How would they throw off the chains of their religious observance? These were taken as ground assumptions for modernization theory. Then, as time went on, it began to become apparent that what was supposed to be fading away was in fact regaining strength. The revival of religion, I think, will become not only an increasing topic for academic concern, but a very challenging topic from the point of view of world history. Because when you have a dominant narrative of world history that says, follow modernity, explain where modernity comes from, define modernity, identify the parameters that need to be tracked as modernity spreads around the world and as the world becomes a global entity. One of the parts of this was that the diminishment of religion would be a given. Now, if religion revives, or rather as religion revives, is it an anomaly? Is it a glitch? Is it somehow modernity not working quite right? Or is it a backlash, an atavistic, Luddite sort of desire to oppose the wave of the future? Or is it something else? Is there something that explains it? If you are immersed in a faith environment, regardless of the faith, whether it's Muslim or Christian or Jewish or Hindu or Buddhist, whatever it is, if you're immersed in a faith environment, you'll find very few people who say that we are opposed to the modern world. We are, we want things to go back to the way they were, X hundred years ago. If you are immersed in the secular world, it appears to you self-evident that these people are not part of the modern world and that they're trying to turn the clock back to a previous age. And if they use the internet and nuclear weapons and so forth in order to move backwards, even though one might argue that these are part of the modern world, then you just say, well, they're confused. They're really backward, but they don't understand backwardness well enough to realize that they shouldn't be using all this cool modern stuff that we invented and made available to them. So there's a problem. Is there a different narrative that would explain why religion began to reappear after World War II? Is there an alternative narrative? Now, I don't know. I don't have to invent one until next fall. But since many people in the West regard the period from World War I through the Cold War as a period of colossal civilizational failure in the terms of the scale of the butchery that occurred, the depth of the fear, the likelihood, seemingly, of planetary extinction, people who looked at it that way really have thought, yeah, but Kant really wouldn't have wanted this. And then you think, well, what is more important, Kant or mutually assured destruction? So you really have the grounding for saying that that the West destroyed itself. It didn't literally destroy itself, but it had its day. It had a certain momentum. It moved in a certain direction, and then it messed up its situation so badly that it opened the door for other people to say there are other avenues, and that what you get now is that the people who are complaining about the return to religion could be viewed as the Luddites, the backward people, the people who refuse to accept that the Western moment came, it was spectacular, and it went. I have no idea whether you could sell that idea as historical analysis or not. And undoubtedly there are bells and whistles you would have to attach to it. But the idea that modernization theory and its successor globalization theory are based on the idea that Western civilization really got it right and has every justification for seeing itself as the future of the planet, you can argue the other direction and say that that they got it wrong. And if you do that, then do you open the door to religion or to something else? You know, Chinese state-controlled development, for example. Non-religious, non-capitalist, non-communist, whatever it is. I don't know. Now finally, the internet is changing everything. And it is going to change historical narratives. And it's going to change them in ways that are very, very difficult to predict. Certainly the last week, where we have seen the release of thousands of secret documents through WikiLeaks. Imagine that happening monthly for the next 10 years, so that there are no secrets. The creation of a means of having a culture that does not have gatekeepers, that's an unmediated culture in which everybody gets to say everything all the time to everybody. You can easily see it as creating the world's biggest informational garbage dump, in which there is so much night soil piling up that you're just buried under it. Or you can say, you know, we can divide this night soil in the most extraordinary ways and derive meaning from it. And of course, this is possible. You know, it opens the door for a huge increase in quantification as a technique for historical study, because there is going to be so much to quantify, and because the scale of the data to be surveyed is so enormous that old notions of expertise are going to disappear. I sit around in my office looking at what a lovely office I have. This is really a terrific office. I have about 4,500 books in it. I think in 50 years, will there be any professor that has 4,500 books in an office? Because why bother? Why have all that stuff that accumulates dust and makes you sneeze? Why have all those books around? And people say, well, there'll be antiquarians who'll have it. I say, well, why would they have it? At a certain point, even they won't bother to have it. You know, we don't have anyone who still has a collection of cuneiform tablets left from the Akkadian period. But there must have been originally, when you had the last cuneiform tablet had been scribed, there must have been for, a century or more, people say, you know, I have these tablets. No, I can't read them, but I am waiting for someone who can read them. I bet they have the coolest stuff on them. Here's one shaped like a sheep liver. You know, people must have saved it and saved it and saved it, and then found that it was worthless. And but it didn't mean that the books become irrelevant, because the books become digitized. You find that you can search better, you'll be able to search better online than you could by walking up and down the stacks of a first-class academic library. Maybe. But historians are going to have to experiment with this, and they're going to have to deal with it. I happen to be someone who really loves cyberpunk science fiction, and in William Gibson's one of the short stories about this future world and so forth, and the technological dystopia that's facing us as our night soil collects. He has a character who's wandering through a flea market on the ruins of the Oakland Bay Bridge, and he finds a book for sale. And it's the Columbia Encyclopedia. And when we published the 4th edition of the Columbia Encyclopedia, I gave a speech on that occasion about the future of encyclopedias, and I thought, well, maybe that's where encyclopedias will end up, in a flea market someplace of no interest. And then what happens to encyclopedic knowledge if it's all so readily available? And I realized that that probably in the course of all this I'll become obsolete, but fortunately I'm old enough not to care a whole lot. So thank you very much.